Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Guillermo Lomas wash processed Ecuador from Cabra. And there's the box right there. And Cabra, originally based out of Aarhus, but their boxes now say Copenhagen, so for the purposes of this review, we'll say based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. But they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including as a major talking point in our reaction to Roastful's Top 100 Coffee Roasters in the World list, as I, as well as you guys, felt like their placement was a little high on that list. But they are a coffee roaster that I do enjoy revisiting from time to time, mostly to see how or if their coffee has changed over the years. And when I saw this coffee, it did catch my interest, as you guys really enjoy Sidra reviews, and it was a wash processed coffee, so it felt like a coffee that I might end up enjoying. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Cabra's recipe, which is a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. I feel like it's a little tricky and difficult to kind of articulate and describe Cabra's roast profiles for their coffees. I feel like at one point they switched to omni roasting all of their coffees, but if I recall correctly, I think that they now have an espresso roast, which would make this one technically their filter roast, though I'm not entirely sure that it is a filter roast. Even if it is, it's not necessarily the lightest coffee out there, as I oftentimes have a difficult time describing coffee roasters that have a similar profile to it in terms of the way that their coffee turns out. So it's not necessarily light, but at the same time, it's not really overly developed. So it kind of falls somewhere in that middle category of that light medium in terms of it. But even then, I don't think that that's necessarily a good descriptor of it, but the best I can come up with for this coffee. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60 with the cup having some slight caramelized sweetness to it at the forefront, with a bit of complementary softer tropical fruit aspects as well. It was reminiscent of what I would describe as being a more citric stone fruit. In addition to that, there was just subtlety to the cup in general, leaving an okay first impression. Day 17 opted for the Chemex, and it was a pretty similar experience to the previous day, as it's offering mostly a delicate citric aspect with some slight tropicality and caramelization as well. There's a lingering, almost honey grain-like aspect to it that I would describe as being reminiscent slightly of Honey Nut Cheerios. Outside of that, it's a pretty long-lasting experience relative to what I typically have for Cabra, so it's been a unique first couple of days for what I typically have from them. Day 20 through the April brewer, and the cup continues to remain best right off brew, as it's offering a citric forward base with more of the slight honey grain to it as well. It's pretty even throughout, with some notable white florals present before offering a caramelized finish yet again. So I would say it's still for the most part been a little bit more soft, a little bit more tame, but that at the same time is much more in line with experiences that I have from Cabra in general. Day 23 through the V60 with Cabra's recipe, and it's pretty similar to the previous days, with the brightness being a little bit more subtle and some slightly softer tropicality. It does open up as it cools down with what to describe as being some soft red berries, some slight vanilla, and a little bit of the caramelized sweetness yet again. Slight honey, with the cup remaining mostly on the delicate side of things, but at this time I said, okay, even though this coffee is delicate, even though there isn't anything that's really taking hold or being overly intense within this coffee, there's enough to kind of pick out and some subtle characteristics here and there, and given that nothing's really standing out, then it's just a little easier to pick out those qualities. Day 26 through the Chemex with Cabra's recipe, and this was by far the best the coffee had been, as there was better definition to the citric floral aspect with better vanilla and caramelized sweetness to it. Soft red berries yet again, and some slight stone fruit and honey, so I was experiencing a lot more of these qualities in a slightly more intense sense. Day 29 through the V60 with Cabra's recipe yet again, and interestingly it felt like the Chemex version of this coffee was notably better, and it's rare that I feel like one brew method is as strong in terms of just overall experience as the Chemex was with this coffee, because the V61, I said, I don't really enjoy too much of this coffee with this brew method, mostly because everything here is just so subtle and it's just kind of on the fringes of really experiencing anything in a very pronounced manner. Whereas the Chemex, I feel like, was a little bit more defined, focused, and just more intense overall. So there was a very strong preference towards that brew method with this coffee. as the focus continued to remain on the citric floral aspect with caramelized sweetness being the most pronounced component within the finish, but for the most part, even then, it was a little bit more toned down compared to the Chemex experience. Day 32, through the Chemex yet again, and it's still better through this brewer as it's offering more of the berry aspects as well, with a slight bit of some citrus and some caramel in the finish. It feels best after a lengthy cool down, almost to the point of room temperature with plenty of the honey yet again. And then day 35, final notes we have through the Chemex one last time, and it did reach a level of consistency with this brew method as it does require a little bit of patience with a little bit too soft and tame of a cup initially off brew, but it did open up a fair bit on the cool down with some softer citric floral aspects present off the brew. And that's the big thing about this coffee is right after I made it, I continued to experience that as a consistent note throughout the entirety of this coffee, but the more and more I drank it, the more I was experiencing just improvement on the cool down, especially with this brew method as it's offering some slight vanilla florality, caramel, and generic citric tones all underneath this red berry and apricot-like aspect with a honeyed component to it in the finish as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And 2 level 4s. So let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So as I always say when it comes to coffees like this, there isn't really anything that can kind of take away from the overall experience of it. I mean, it's not necessarily overly roasty. It doesn't have any sort of funkiness, fermentiness to it. And while the profile to it isn't necessarily the most clean and defined, I would say that, no, I shouldn't say cleaner and defined, but like precise, defined, or just, it doesn't necessarily have the same sort of definition in general that a lot of other coffees have. It still doesn't have anything that can kind of take away from that level 4. So I think the best thing and best place I can put this is at the lower side of level 4, because while the profiles aren't necessarily overly pronounced, there isn't anything to really take away from the overall clarity of this coffee. Finish level 4, and I said that it does have a lengthy finish, but that's relative to what I typically experience from Cabra coffees, as for the most part they do tend to be a little bit more toned down and tame in general. This one was a little different in that regard, mostly because it did seem to have a little bit of an extended finish with the caramel and honey-like aspect. But I think relative to the majority of coffees that we review in general, it still is probably on the slightly lower side of the level 4, but definitely on the higher side relative to what we experienced from them. And then a handful of level 3s, and this is a little bit more common from what I have typically experienced with Cabra's coffees. Nothing really standing out, and that's why we'll go through them one by one real quick. Sweetness level 3, it's on the sweeter side of what I typically experience from Cabra coffee, and that mostly came in terms of the caramelized sweetness as well as that slight honey sweetness to it. Even then, they're not necessarily achieving overly high levels, especially relative to a lot of the coffees that we review. Acidity level 4, not a whole lot of brightness, and I think the adjustments we made toned down whatever high level of, not even high level of brightness, but whatever moderate level of brightness there was to begin with this coffee. So I think our adjustments played a slight role in that, but even then, it's not necessarily going to be the brightest coffee out there. Florality, level 3, and I've described a number of floral aspects. There's a citric floral aspect, there's a white floral aspect, there's a honeyed aspect, and then there's like a honey florality, and then there's a vanilla-like florality to it. So there's an abundance of them, but nothing really overly pronounced or overly heavy within this coffee, so that's why it still remains a little bit more toned down at that level 3 mark. All the fruit components reaching that level 3, as I could feel a fair bit of the red berry-like aspect to this one. Citrus mentioned was a little bit more of a generic citric quality, and then the stone fruit, once again, a little bit more soft, subtle of, I would describe as being slightly more sugary, so maybe we could align this a little bit closer with either a white peach or a little bit of an apricot-like component. But the reason they're even scoring that level 3 is mostly because the rest of this coffee is a little bit more toned down, so you can see and feel those aspects in a little bit more pronounced of a sense. Chocolate level 3, and it's a little bit more of that, we'll just say high percentage milk chocolate, like a little bit of a craft milk chocolate, which is usually the best way I like to describe that when it's in a coffee like this, present within it. Caramel level 3, and that's probably the most pronounced and consistent note within this coffee, and even then it wasn't necessarily overly intense, so it still scores there at the level 3. And then I think the only 2 things worth discussing outside of that is actually there's only two other things worth discussing outside of that. Body level 3, it did have a little bit of texture, and that's interesting given that it was brewed with the Chemex, but medium bodied enough, so it scored high in that regard. And then final thing worth discussing is the smokiness at a level 2. And that's something that I was referencing when I was discussing the roast profile, because it's not really a roasty coffee, but even then it's not necessarily like overly light. So I just kind of wanted to mark that mostly because it seems to kind of align with this coffee's just unique profile that I'm experiencing from it. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It is kind of interesting that Le Cabra's tasting wheels seem to always kind of look that way whenever I'm reviewing them, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of that because I continue to feel like their coffees just continue to come out, at least their wash process coffees, is very tame. And I try not to review any of the other coffees mostly because a lot of the stuff that they offer isn't necessarily a coffee that I think I would enjoy in the first place. I think that they had one from Juan Peña, which was a very experimentally processed coffee that I have a pretty strong feeling that I wouldn't necessarily enjoy. And I think it's one thing if this was just my impression of these coffees every time I had them because it could be perceived as maybe a little bit of a bias. But they have featured in some of our Cafe Box Advent Calendar blind taste tests, and they don't necessarily perform overly well in those videos either. So I think it's just kind of safe to say it's not really my thing, and that continues to be the case. And every time I revisit them with a coffee that on paper should be one that I enjoy a little bit more, it turns out to be this way, just a little bit more tame and subtle than what I would necessarily like from my wash processed coffees. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, that's exactly the direction I would point somebody towards with this one, and that's somebody that looks for a coffee that's much more balanced. And I think it helps that they list these coffees as being balanced because that's the best thing I can say about them. They're balanced. They seem to offer an equal level of fruit components, sweetness, brightness, clarity. Like all of these things still seem to hover around that 2 to 4 range, and that's typically what I experience. Nothing really scores a 1, nothing really scores a 5, and it all continues to remain just equally balanced overall. So there's something to be made for coffees that do turn out very balanced like this one, as I feel like a lot of people can enjoy a much more balanced cup with something like this. But that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Guillermo Lomas Wash Processed Ecuador from Le Cabra. Thank you for watching.